To Aging Fabulously, and we've added Aging Gracefully, meeting the needs of our aging communities. We'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the Gadigal people, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. In order to ensure that all our voices are heard today, the way to interact with today's session is through the app, and if you're here in person and via the virtual platform for those watching at home or from watching parties wherever you are, and it's wonderful that you are joining us in that way. The chat function can be found under the Ideas tab, and you can also submit questions which can be upvoted. So please get voting for your favourite questions so that they can get put up in front of us here and make sure that those questions reach us. I also want to let everyone know that there will be a very culturally significant moment at the end of today. First National representatives of Sydney World Pride will be handing over a message stick to representatives of Capital Pride, a symbol of how our conversations will continue in Washington, DC, and all of the World Prides to come. So please make sure that you stick around for this incredible moment at the end of the day. It's quite often tempting at the end of a busy 3 days to depart a little early, but let's all stay and be part of that really significant moment. So my name is Nicky. It's a real honour to be here. I'm the CEO of LGBTIQ plus Health Australia. We're the peak body for LGBTIQ plus health and wellbeing here in Australia. And as I say, it's absolutely wonderful to be here, and my pronouns are she, her. I have the really privileged job today to be facilitating a conversation between two very incredible people. Grace Poore, who's up on the screen, is joining us from Maryland, USA, just outside of DC, is a senior advisor of Special Projects Asia at Outright International. She coordinates Outright Asia, LGBTIQ network on SOGI and gender-based evaluation, and heads Outright Asia's regional hub of the Elders Advancing Project on impacts of age-based discrimination in the Philippines and Nepal. And I invite you to have a good read of Grace's full bio on the conference app. And here with me on stage is Irlam, who's the Deputy CEO of Council of the Ageing, fondly known as COTA, Australia, and has played a critical and central role in national LGBTI law and policy reform work since 2007. You can trust me when I say that Corey has led the way for much of the work in LGBTI health and wellbeing and in advancing the rights of LGBTI older people, and I invite you to also look at his wonderful full bio on the conference app. So just to set the scene a little bit for this session, the WHO states that every person in every country in the world should have the opportunity to live a long and healthy life. Yet the environments in which we live can favour health or be harmful to it. Environments are highly influential on our behaviour and on our exposure to health risks, for example, air pollution or violence, our access to services, for example, health and social care, and the opportunities that ageing brings. The number and proportion of people aged 60 years and older in the population is increasing. In 2019, the number of people aged 60 years and older was 1 billion, and this number will increase to 1.4 billion by 2030 and 2.1 billion by 2050. And this increase is occurring at an unprecedented pace and will accelerate in coming decades, particularly in developing countries. The Australian Human Rights Commission states that older people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans or gender diverse or intersex can face particular issues later in life, especially in accessing safe and inclusive aged care services. Older people are likely to have experienced a history of stigma, isolation, criminalisation of homosexuality during most of their lifetime, and this can have consequences for how private and discreet some individuals are about their sexuality and gender. a trend of returning to live in the closet once entering aged care due to fear of discrimination and misunderstanding in a new communal environment. And there may be health consequences for not being out in aged care particularly, and in accessing services and programs, for example, for people living with HIV. So we won't get through everything today in the session, but let's see what we can bring into the conversation that we will have. And I just would like to sort of start by talking about ageing broadly, and for LGBTIQ plus people, noting that LGBTIQ plus people are not a homogenous group of people, and that we have differing perspectives here. I mean, here in Australia, we talk about LGBTI older people, because here the notion of using that term queer is still a very uncomfortable language to be using. In other countries, that's not the same. So even from that basic principle, let alone until we start to dig deeper, there's differences. But Grace, from the Asia and Pacific Islands perspective, tell me about ageing in the region.
Okay. I'd actually like to start with providing some positive examples of aging in the region, sharing 3 short quotes from people. The first one is from Jean Cristobal, who is my outright colleague, who is stationed in Quezon City, Philippines. And she says that family acceptance makes aging for LGBTIQ people a positive experience in the Philippines, and that because after many years of activism for LGBTIQ rights, there's been a change in family acceptance. For example, more family members are attending commitment ceremonies. A lesbian in Taiwan, a 62-year-old lesbian in Taiwan named Tong, she says, in my 40s, I did not accept myself as a lesbian. Now I do. Before, I had to hide my thoughts and feelings. I was afraid. I was not happy inside. In my 40s, I lived for other people. Now I live for myself. It's about self-identity. I have a lot of support in my friends' community. I'm happier. Tong provides daily caregiving for her elderly mother. William is a gay man, 56 years old, also from Taiwan, and he says, I have a huge friends group. Compared to 20, 30 years ago, I am more confident now. I have a boyfriend of 11 years. During COVID, my work engagements were canceled. It forced me to stay 3.5 hours away from Taipei, where I have lived for 30 years. But it gave me time to finish my book, which was published in 2021, called The 30-Year Crusade of LGBTI Rights Movement in Taiwan, Viewpoints from an Activist. William also provides full-time daily caregiving for his elderly mother, and he shares these duties with 2 siblings. Now, I highlight the caregiving aspects of aging because for LGBTIQ people, who are locked out of biological family support, they have difficulty accessing elder care. On the other hand, in Taiwan and Philippines, and probably in much of Asia, there's evidence that LGBTIQ elders or older people who remain with their families are the ones who are providing caregiving to older family members, to children in the extended families, to relatives with disabilities. Single older people in Asia are often designated as the parental caregivers, which is often long work. And for many LGBTIQ older people who are providing caregiving, while also having, for instance, to hide their own sexual orientation and gender, or with little support for being LGBTIQ, this is a challenging reality in many ways and needs to be addressed. So now, Nicky, I'd like to go to some of the harsher realities of aging in Asia, if I may. I'd like to share some information very quickly from a 2022 survey of older LGBTIQ people ages 50 and above living in the Philippines and Nepal. Now, while the tradition in these 2 countries is to pay tribute to older people and respect and care for elders, many LGBTIQ older people were disproportionately affected by the lifelong and intersectional discrimination. And this is across the lifespan in all sectors: schooling, jobs, health services, community, family. A significant number of them were expecting to lose their homes within the year due to unaffordable rents, demolition, eviction, loss of shared living spaces with friends and community members who were themselves under-resourced and facing housing challenges. In Nepal, LGBTI older people in the survey could not afford doctor visits because they cannot access medical insurance. Paid pensions were inadequate. Many of the older people could not receive the senior citizen allowance due to discriminatory eligibility requirements, or because they had no citizenship documents. Lesbians, bisexual women, and trans and third gender people are not eligible for the single women allowance. And in both the Nepal and Philippines, many older LGBTIQ people were struggling to cover daily expenses like food, medicine, and they had little or no support from government programs, including aging services. And I'll just stop there for now, Nicky.
Grace, thank you. I mean, you've given a really broad perspective, and what's interesting for me in hearing you speak is, while there's great differences, the similarities between what you see in Asia and the Pacific Islands and here in Australia. Corey, I was wondering if there was anything that you wanted to add in relation to the Australian experience of ageing.
Yeah, sure. Look, I just want to put an international of the region context. So 2014, I was on the International Lesbian Gay Association board, went to some international conferences, zero discussions on ageing. Okay. 2015-16, LGBT funders for the first time ever started tracking what sort of international funding there was towards older people, $0. Okay, 2019-20, 3% of funding, something like 4.7 million. So we're seeing a slow increase in actually paying attention to these issues on an international level. I think partly because of the ageing population, but partly because also we as a community don't like talking about getting older, and we're finally starting to talk about getting older. You know, I love the boomers, but the boomers change every generation. The thing that they enter into is a very large stereotype of a generation, and that's part of the reason why I think we're starting to see that enhancement now. I think from an Australian context, though, we need to recognise we are very privileged compared to many of our peers overseas. We have anti-discrimination laws. Aged care is the only place where religious exemption does not apply here in Australia. We actually have policies and procedures. We had the first LGBTI ageing aged care strategy in 2012. Around the world, first time that governments had recognised that a strategy intersex. Here in Australia, first time there was something specifically in aged care. So we've had almost a decade of laws, policies, and now we're in the program phase, okay? We're starting to see funding and specific programs happening. Some Western countries are already there with us. Some are sort of just in that policy to program phase. And the next frontier for us, I think, is ageism and how we actually change societal expectation.
I think that's right, Corey. I mean, I've worked in different sectors. My background really was in working in with people who use drugs illicitly. And what I see in Australia from an ageing perspective, the systems and the processes are extraordinary. I mean, the government is, for example, funding training and capacity building for aged care providers to be able to work with our communities. We need to take stock and really, you know, recognise while we have a lot to do, there are some amazing processes and policies, as you say. When we talk about ageism, and there's a number of issues that have been discussed there, can we spend some time before we sort of drill down a bit more to think about ageism in our communities? You know, we've spoken before in the meetings that we've had around this session that we really value youth, and therefore our sort of default position is on an assumption that ageing is bad. And can we unpack that from your different perspectives, what LGBTI communities' own barriers are to ageing? Maybe, Corey, I'll come to you first this time.
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing to say is ageism is gendered. Okay, the experience of ageism of women versus men versus trans versus genderqueer is going to be different because the intersectionality between sexism and ageism is really, really strong. Really interestingly, gay men do not like to talk about getting older unless you've identified as a daddy, I think is the way. One of the really, really cool things that happened this week was I went to the pre-conference caucus of older people, and there's a gentleman who stood up and said, I like to have radical ageism by going once a month onto a dance floor and letting people essentially see that there's somebody with white hair that still goes out dancing. And I think that's a cool way that an individual has been able to embrace their ageism. So thank you to him for sharing that story, because I really think it's a great thing that came out of this conference. For women, however, you've got financial security issues, housing issues that you see in older women generally, but also particularly really there with older queer women, if I can use that term, because I know it's not really a culturally age-appropriate term. What's really interesting there, I think, is that we have this perception by many government policymakers and businesses that the entire community are a dink, okay, a double income, no kid, and therefore there's this perception that actually we're all affluent. But there's a really big underbelly of people who aren't affluent, who have had a lifetime of discrimination, who have a compounding effect of not having earned income. And so we need to really actually recognise that we drill into that data and see the reality of what's there. And yes, you do have some really high-flying, affluent people who are often the most confident to be visible and therefore are the most seen. We need to think about how we raise up those voices of people who are in that underbelly category and actually show that there's a lot of disadvantage still happening for older people in our community.
That disadvantage lens is an important one, so that I think there is that stereotype, isn't there, of that, particularly amongst gay men, I think, is that partying, you have no children, and that your life is about partying and going out and all of those things, when in fact we know, as you've described as that underbelly, there are many people in our communities that are highly disenfranchised, isolated, with very limited income, poor housing, etc. We need to shine the light there. From the perspective that you have, Grace, with regards to the valuing of youth and the barriers, what's your perspective on that from what you see from within our communities?
Well, actually, I want to pick up where Corey, the last thing that Corey said. When I think about, ageism in LGBTIQ communities, I actually think about the cumulative impacts of lifelong stigma and discrimination that affects people's aging and the quality of their lives. Aging, as I can attest, aging comes with changes in physical and mental health. And for LGBTIQ people who have been struggling for a long time, living longer, getting older, can be like trying not to fall off a narrow ledge. Now, is that negative ageist thinking? I don't think so. Because when one looks at the increasing impacts of discrimination and the shrinking avenues of support for LGBTIQ people, I think that aging can be seen as a burden. And that's not necessarily an ageist thing to say. What stands out for me about the internal barriers in the LGBTIQ communities is generational differences. People in their 50s may have been exposed to LGBTIQ groups and to pride events. And this perhaps has prompted a number of them to resist remaining in the closet. But many LGBTIQ older people, like people in their 60s and 70s, regardless of whether their countries had LGBTIQ groups or a movement back then, or regardless of whether the environment in their countries has become more friendly towards LGBT people, like in Taiwan, for example, people in their 60s and 70s are reluctant to share their status as LGBTI, even, for instance, when, say, researchers are working on LGBTIQ issues or NGOs are gathering information on service usage. People in their 60s and 70s remember. They have memories of negative experiences from their younger days. And they don't want to relive those negative memories. They have memories of family abuse and strife. And they fear that exposing their SOGI status will bring all of that back. And, the best way to say it is that they have learned to live stealthily. And some of them are in long-term heterosexual cisgender marital arrangements that they were forced into. Some had experienced loss of younger same-sex partners who left to enter heterosexual cisgender marriages. So these are all complex realities for LGBTI older people to contend with. Whether they are partnered or whether they have friends or whether they are socially isolated to the point where, there may be no one to accompany them to the doctor. So just to add one more point, Nicky, is that some activists say that if older LGBTI people do not share their SOGI status, there will continue to be data gaps from lack of disaggregated data. For instance, whether LGBTIQ older people were able to access emergency assistance during COVID or services during climate disasters, or what kind of health issue access issues are they facing. It's true that if people do not provide information about their identities, it makes data gathering and evidence-based advocacy difficult. But I think that there is a legitimacy to LGBTI people's fears and anxieties and not wanting to say on a form or reveal even to people who are doing research what their status is. I think that we need to find different ways to do data gathering, spending more time trust building, for example, using different methods for data gathering, proving the trustworthiness of data gatherers and proving the trustworthiness of how the data will be used, and not just sending out surveys on social media and email. So I've sort of deviated from what you were asking me, but I think it's very relevant to how we look at ageism within LGBTI communities.
Grace, there's so many important things in what you've just raised. I mean, just wanting to touch before coming over to you, Poore, on that notion of the cumulative impact on mental health and physical health. And now we can describe that under that banner of minority stress and understand what that process of minority stress does to us over time. And I often talk when we're advocating to government and policymakers about the fact that, for us to change that for future generations, those dreadful mental health stats we see and those other health and wellbeing disparities, how we've got to get it right for young people so that their trajectory and their rite of passage is different. And also with those data gaps, the data gaps also exist because we're not asked those questions to begin with. So lots of research doesn't ask about sex, gender, variations of sex characteristics or sexual orientation. And we're just remaining invisible. So there's that whole notion of aging and being invisible, and then the data's not supporting that also. It's a complex a picture that you're presenting. Anything that you want to add into that, Poore?
I just think to add to Grace's list about trust, I also think people who capture data need to explain why they want it. If they actually explain to somebody, if you give me this data, it will help mount the case to help fund services, I find we get a much better response rate. But if you just put it on a form and you just go, hey, tick these boxes, people go, nah, it's none of your business.
Is there anything specific that either of you want to say on that notion of the value of being young versus that value of being older within our communities? Like, what do we need to... When I think about LGBTIQ plus communities and the way that we interface, talking about that person who goes onto the dance floor once a month, we often talk about what happens on the outside, but what are we doing on the inside of our communities to be looking after and looking to the experience and the contributions that older LGBTIQ plus people make?
Yes. So I think first thing I'd say is let's look right inside ourselves. We talk a lot about internalised homophobia, but actually we don't talk about internalised ageism and about how we actually feel about our own age. Some of the research that Council on the Ageing does shows that not LGBTI specific, but general populations in Australia feel about 12 years younger than they really are over the age of 50. And that kind of tells you it's great because they're feeling good and they're feeling healthy. But it also tells you what their perception is about what it means to be their own age, that they want to always be younger, that we want to look more younger, that we want to feel more younger, that I'm not that other person that I see in the mirror when I wake up every morning. I'm in this sort of moment where I just want to get rid of the colour and I'll just become Santa Claus because, then I'll be the full age spectrum. There we go. It works with the day job though. I think when you look at the community aspect though, how do we build programs and spaces and opportunities for older people to come into and deliver something from a values, from an adding value perspective? So often we actually go, older people need services. You talked about older LGBTI, people hear aged care. Actually, people don't get aged care until they're like 75, 80. What are we talking about for the people who are 50, 60, 70? They actually want to participate and have a community space, and we don't do very much to actually invite them in. So how do we actually fund those programs? There are some intergenerational programs. A number of people around the country, including COTA South Australia and I think also COTA Tasmania, run a thing called the Community Visitor Scheme. And I'm going to get Jackie to stand up and wave a hand. She's here from COTA South Australia, so you can talk to her about the Community Visitor Scheme. And Meredith over there from Victoria with Switchboard runs the one in Victoria. These are really small little programs that create an opportunity for an older person who might be socially isolated to connect with another person in the community that's usually younger, not always, doesn't have to be. How do we fund more of these? How do we actually build that in? For the people here who do programs, do you actually do outreach to older people to actually get them to come and support and volunteer? Do you create that culturally safe, age-safe environment for them to come and do it? I don't see a lot of it. So I think if we can actually build that in there, we'll find more people coming through.
Thanks. And Grace, are there examples from the Asia and Pacific Islands of how LGBTIQ plus communities are engaging in really helpful and, what's the word I'm looking for? Meaningful connection between younger and older LGBTIQ plus people?
Yes. Outright is partnering with SAGE and LGBTIQ groups in the Philippines and Nepal. And the project is to build intergenerational awareness and activism and advocacy. For both projects, elders advisory committees or groups have been formed where elders are actually working closely with people who are heading the projects who are not necessarily younger. They might be in their 50s or they might be in their 40s, but they're sort of advising, providing input on how the projects that are about aging and elders' lives should be developed or shared with the community. It's been difficult. It's been a bit of a challenge because people don't show up to trainings, or people don't show up to workshops, or they don't show up to meetings. And sometimes I hear that, it's difficult to work with older people because they are not very reliable in their participation. And I kind of push back a little bit to say, I think maybe we need to change our expectations of how we want people to show up, because many of the people who are participating in the Philippines and Nepal projects are retired, or if they're still working, their wages are very low. The COVID pandemic devastated many of them. And so they're asking for livelihood assistance, right? And when we create our budgets, for example, we don't factor those things in. Even simple things like providing transport allowance and making sure that the transport is accessible to people with disabilities who have mobility issues. And especially with the COVID, where everything is happening online, people have difficulty with having a computer or having an iPhone or using or negotiating Zoom, or how to deal with it. And I think that in order for us to have elders, and I use the word elders because that's what's used in Nepal, and older people to participate actively in our programs, we have to provide resources so that it's possible for them to participate. And that we have to be very intentional about that. And livelihood assistance is something that keeps coming up, but it doesn't have to be livelihood assistance. It could just be making sure that we compensate, making sure that we are paying attention to the needs of older people, which we don't have to think about when we are dealing with younger people.
There's so much to think about with that social connection. I'd like to just give a shout out though to Russ and the Love Project at ACON, and I can remember participating in some of those these amazing events that Russ puts on, where he very cleverly has dancing and afternoon tea and a little sort of cocktail hour, and interweaves into all of this wonderful stuff, falls prevention, and how people can join walking groups. And it's a wonderful formula that the Love Project has, because people don't want to come to a workshop on falls prevention, but will absolutely come to a dance and then also be thinking about falling over and how can I join a walking group so that I can get stronger. It's a beautiful recipe for success, Russ. We've been focused in community, and I'm just wondering if I can invite you both to step out of that just for a moment and to be thinking structural from that program and policy perspective. What are the barriers that you're seeing at that sort of systems level in relation to ageing, aged care, program provision? What do you see, Poore?
Look, I think number one, not going to be any surprise, funding. Okay, you might be lucky if you get a 3-year funding grant. In this space, maybe for $100,000 a year, possibly to run something, and out of that you've got to pay a staff member and put a roof over their head and then actually put on the events. That's not really sustainable to be able to go out and reach the population that's there. So how do we actually invest in that better? One of the really interesting conversations happening in, let's call it the general ageing space, is Australia's passed a lot of dying with dignity laws. Okay, so there's a lot more conversations about end of life happening at the moment. It's something that our community has always had a little bit of a conversation about. When I've been talking about aged care in particular, I remember back in 2009, I quoted the Sydney Morning Herald, "I'd rather swing off in the backyard off the gecko tree than go into aged care," by a wonderful older gay man at the time. So we talk about it. How do we actually lead that conversation in Australia, for example? We have some fabulous creative approaches of how we can do things as a community, and we've revolutionised the way we look at things. Let's bring that to the general population in end of life. How can we be funded and supported to do that? It's something that we're thinking about at COTA, and again, talk to Jackie about that later on if you're in South Australia and want to collaborate on those sort of things, because it's important that we not only fund it, but that we actually also be creative about it. You know, just because we're getting older doesn't mean we're any less fabulous, you know? So how we actually go about embracing those unique different ways that we do things. Talked about the intergenerational programs. The harsh reality is there's still a problem with finding a roof over some people's heads, okay? So the housing programs that we have for older people generally, and particularly older LGBTI people, still need to tackle these challenges in a really robust way, because life changes happen. You know, you get divorced, your partner dies, your kids try and take your money. All of these things happen later in life that we just don't talk about, that change your financial security. We're starting to see the emergence or the re-emergence in the LGBTI community about making sure we quarantine some funding for community-controlled organisations, so that we've not got mainstream services reaching out to us. We need to see that, and you know, to sort of bring through something from the earlier caucus. One of the things that people said, obviously, as I said before, was that they don't want just services, they want to see spaces and opportunities available to them. We want respect, community and a place. We want respect for the work that older LGBTI did to create the freedoms that we enjoy today, and we want the younger generation to understand they can be taken away in a moment. So how do we actually create an opportunity for those dialogues between older and younger people to occur? I don't see very much of that happening in the community.
And Grace, you know, I keep saying that we have these very, very dynamic, different perspectives. But from your perspective in the countries that you're working in, from that sort of policy and program level, what are the barriers that you see? I mean, there'll be a whole range of issues in the countries you're working in, including, you know, the role that donors play, the whole gamut. What's that lens like from your perspective?
Well, first of all, there's such a chronic invisibility of LGBTI older adults, you know, whether it's in government or NGO services, you know, aging services. And there was a survey done, I think, in 2005 in Taiwan, where they asked two hospitals, would you accept LGBTIQ elders, so older people in the hospital? And there were 100 responses, and they all said yes. And then they asked the question, have you met LGBTI? And all of them said no. And so there were LGBTIQ people going to those hospitals, but they did not reveal, or the questions were not asked, or assumptions were made. So this chronic invisibility, I think, leads to not understanding the needs of LGBTI people, asking the right kinds of questions, trying to figure out why people are not coming to the doctor. It's not just about not having money or having difficulty with transport. It's also about being afraid of talking to the doctor, or going to, you know, lesbians going to male doctors in countries, and they don't want to. So I think the invisibility issue is so important and is so critical that it kind of drives everything. The other barrier, which is very different from the Australian context, is that people can't access senior citizen benefits or social security that other elders and other older people are able to access for a number of reasons. Most of it having to do with eligibility requirements, which are discriminatory, lack of information on how to access these benefits, or simply being denied because people have different definitions of family and different definitions of who can access what kind of benefits. And I think the last thing is, even though countries like, for example, Nepal and the Philippines have senior citizen laws, and they don't have, these laws are not implemented in a way that protects LGBTIQ people. Even if some of these laws protect other marginalized elders and other marginalized older people, they are not applied, they are not implemented so LGBTIQ people can benefit and can be protected. So in the Philippines, for example, they've formed a group of elders, have formed a group with our partners there, people in their 50s and 60s. And it's a circle of activists who are working with elder rights advocates as well as policy advocates to amend the Philippines senior citizen law so that they are creating a new category called pre-seniors, people who are in the ages of 50 to 59, so that there's increased and broader access to senior citizen benefits. Because the older people that we talk to, they want to work. They need to work because they need income. And they strongly asked for training for new job skills so that they can work in jobs that are out there, that they are aware of. And there's an almost desperate need for that. And I think that the way in which we approach the needs of elder people will be different from, say, other vulnerable groups because they are at the intersection of being LGBTI as well as people who are old. And then with all of the layers of other layers that they're having to deal with, from poverty to dealing with other kinds of discrimination because of who they are.
There's so much there, and visibility and talking about things I think is really important. And I'll take the prerogative as the facilitator to say that we really need to talk about menopause, and it's really not fabulous. In fact, it's really expensive for those of us who can afford to get treatment in relation to menopause, but it's quite frantically, I don't know, it's very challenging every day.
Nicky, there's also a cost opportunity in terms of the impact of menopause on how much you earn because of time off work and therefore retirement.
Sure. One of the concerns I have is that unless you've got money, you can't access HRT, for example, and I think that should be a universal. It should come out of the tap, actually. Once you get to a certain age, it should just be like fluoride in the tap, and we should just be able to get it, because it is, let me tell you, it is life transforming. Before we just start to wrap up, but just to bring into the room, Meredith Butler's noting, how can we ensure that older LGBTIQA plus people can more easily access community, cultural and physical spaces. Our lovely Teresa Savage, who we all adore, is recognising the role of choirs and how very age inclusive and supportive, and of course agrees with the shout out for the Love Project. Lynn L is talking about not much being available in my area for support for anyone 50 plus or even 30 plus. There's so much for people under 25, and that's in Aotearoa. And how do we start to change this? And Malcolm has a comment there on, is there a difference, actually you might want to talk to this, is there a difference between how Asian cultures respect elders, older people, compared to how Western cultures treat them? Do we want to comment on that? We have to start to wrap up.
Look, what I will say is that in general terms, the traditional respect for elders is there in many cultures, and I'd love to see it in France in many Western cultures. One of the emerging trends with the rise of the middle class in some of those cultures is a shifting away from an expectation of the family unit looking after their elders. And so there's a bit of a tension going on between the generation of elders wanting their kids to look after them, the kids going, no, I want services that I'll pay for to look after them. So that's an emerging trend that I'm seeing through some, but Grace might have some LGBTI-specific thoughts on that.
Any thoughts there, Grace?
I think Asian governments expect families to take care of the elders. That's almost like an unsaid mandatory expectation. But the reality is that elders, I think you said at the very beginning, elders are not this monolithic group. They are different. And so how people are viewed and treated will vary on whether they are accepted. And many, many LGBTIQ people have been locked out of their family structures. They have left home. They have very bad relationships with their families. And so you can't expect families to take care of people who they don't want. And so governments have a responsibility. And NGO sector really needs to change the whole culture of how they provide services. And I think that how older people are integrated and their contributions to society need to be looked at very, very differently, rather than just seeing them as service users or that as people who need, rather than, people who are themselves providing lots of care. Like in Nepal, for example, LGBTI elders want the older people to be able to be active in political parties. They want political participation. That is one way, I think, to elevate the voices of LGBTI people. I'll just stop there.
So I'm going to give you a bit of a little minute while I bring in Gregory Halloran's point there, which I think is an important one to think about. you've just got a sentence or two to leave your takeaway messages for the audience today. And while you think about that, I'm just going to bring in an important point that Gregory has raised here and asking, is there a relationship between the lack of older LGBTIQIA visibility in institutions and media and at the social environment, or are these independent phenomena? But I think that's a really important point, because even when we think about our visibility across the age span in some of these areas, particularly in the media, we've got a long way to go in how we are represented in those spaces. And in fact, when we look at the media, for example, the collateral damage that comes from representation, particularly about trans and gender diverse people, is immense. And so, Corey,
So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem.
Yep.
They're not independent, they are interwoven.
Interwoven, totally.
But if more older LGBTI people stood up to be visible, more media and institutions and social environments would create them. But unless actually those environments welcome them, more people won't actually stand up. So my challenge to all of you, if you're an older LGBTI person, what can you do that's radical to actually make yourself seen and heard in the next 3 months? And if you're a person here running a program, what one thing are you going to do to actually invite older LGBTI people into the things that you do? Think about that over the next 3 months. Email me what you did. I'd love to get a collection.
Fantastic. And Grace, your closing remark for the audience here.
I've been involved, my organization, Outright International, has been involved in trying to get a new UN convention on the rights of older persons. And a lot of Age with Rights campaign work that's going on globally. And I think that people who are involved in these kinds of advocacy efforts, or people who are just activists, right, who are trying to queer the human rights space, or trying to queer the women's rights space, or the humanitarian assistance space, or the development space, or whatever space, not only queer the space, but also intentionally integrate LGBTIQ aging issues and perspectives and voices in those spaces. And I think that we really, all of us together, we really need to push for this new convention that's being advocated to definitely have language that is LGBTI inclusive.
Thanks, Grace. You know, being part of this session at the conference for me has been a real privilege, and going on that journey with you, and this, it should have been 45, I think it's going to be 49 minutes, has been great. But in closing, I think what we can say is that Aging Fabulously is an incredible challenge. But before we go, can we please acknowledge each and every LGBTIQ plus older person who has gone before us, and on whose shoulders each and every one of us stand, and how absolutely fabulous each and every one of them they are. Please join me in thanking our panel members.